Well, thanks very much to the organizers and to the hosts for that very kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here today. It's an honor to be invited. Let me dive right into what I want to talk about. So this is a talk about why, in an age of almost ubiquitous potential connectivity, we still see so many people left out of global networks and debates and conversations. And the way that I want to start talking about this issue is with a broader discussion about some of the reasons that uneven geographies of knowledge matter. And I want to start by talking about a very old map. This map that you're looking at here is from the 13th century, and it's called the Carter Pizana. It's important because it's the world's oldest surviving navigational chart. Now, traditionally, information and knowledge about the world have been highly geographically constrained. The transmission of information, what it required was either the movement of people or the movement of media that were capable of communicating that knowledge. And I think if we look at historical maps, they offer us quite a good illustration of some of the geographic limitations to knowledge transmission. So this thing that you're looking at here, the Carta Pizana, it was produced somewhere on the Italian peninsula. If you can see it, it depicts relatively accurate information about the Mediterranean, less accurate information about the fringes of Europe, and then no information at all about parts of the world that are further afield. And I think this example, what it starkly does is illustrate some of the constraints that are placed on knowledge by distance. In the 13th century, transportation and communication technologies, in other words, ships and books, they allowed some of the constraints of distance to be overcome by the map's Italian cartographers. But in the 13th century, those technologies just weren't effective enough to allow detailed knowledge about the Americas or East Asia or much of the rest of the world to be accurately represented on this map. But not only have some parts of the world been traditionally left off the map, some parts of the world just also produce far more codified and transmittable knowledge than others. So if we look at the distribution of academic journals, we see a very vivid pattern of the concentration of knowledge production in only certain parts of the world. So this chart that you're looking at here, it's a chart of all journals in what's called the Web of Knowledge Journal Citation Reports. This is probably the world's most influential collection of academic content. The x-axis there is the number of journals published in a country, and on your y-axis, those are countries. That bar on the bottom is the United States, the one right above it is the United Kingdom, and what you can basically see is that the US and the UK publish far more indexed academic journals than the whole rest of the world put together. Now, the problem is that these two types of information inequality that I've talked about, unevenness in the representation of places and unevenness in the participation from places, they can potentially start to reinforce each other as information and physical places become increasingly intertwined. Increasingly intertwined because of all of the layers of computer code and digital content that augment the world and help us to enact our everyday lives. So the point is that while these geographies of information have always mattered, they maybe matter more than ever now because of the ways in which the digital and the material are increasingly woven together to produce these augmented spaces in which the digital is both representing and comprising space. Or said differently, we used to talk about a map not being the territory, right? The map is a representation of the territory, but in some ways the map, or at least the data or information, is very much becoming the territory. The pipe is becoming the pipe, if you will. We also need to remember, though, as geographers and cartographers have for a very long time argued that representations of space or place, they're never neutral things, they're always entailing power-laden stabilizations of understanding. So this immersive and augmented content that I've been talking about, it also matters because any distortions in these virtual mirrors can have potentially powerful feedback effects into the very things that they're representing. And this has only increased the importance of information that's created in the world's cores and potentially reinforced what scholar Manuel Castells refers to as the black holes of informational capitalism. Having said all that, though, as we move to some of the practices of technology and information usage that I've just described, in which we augment our material worlds with digital content, you might think there's a literal and a metaphorical space for more locally relevant information about all of the rest of the world. And maybe we already expect a lot of this information to be representative and comprehensive and precise and almost ubiquitous. So Google, for instance, they tell us that their core aim is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Their former vice president of location services, now the boss of Yahoo, she tells us that they're trying to build a virtual mirror of the world at all times. And the vision is not just that information will be ubiquitously available, but also that contributions will be democratized. So for instance, when the former Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, when he was talking about bringing internet access to the world's currently disconnected, he was saying that when that happens, and I'll quote him here, all the world's citizens will have the potential to access unlimited knowledge, to express themselves freely, and to contribute to and enjoy the benefits of the knowledge society. So these are powerful ideas, right? And they really permeate all levels of discourse about ICT and development. So what I want to do in the rest of the time that I have is to examine some of these geographies of knowledge that are produced and reproduced in our internet age, and do this in order to better understand how ICTs might enable new geographies of knowledge in and about some of the world's most disadvantaged places. Why don't we talk about some of the barriers to that ever happening, though? Let's just start by looking at who is actually on the internet. So much of the sharing and the creation of information that happens today, it happens online, right? If you're not connected, you simply can't participate in any of that. So what you're looking at here is a map of global internet penetration that I made with my colleague Ralph Straumann. It's a cartogram, so what that means is the size of each country indicates the total number of users in that country, and the shading indicates the penetration rate. It's obviously very uneven. Some countries like the US have both a large total number of users and a high penetration rate. China, in contrast, has the world's largest internet population, but still a relatively low internet penetration rate. And then you get most of the rest of the world, parts of Asia, South America, all of Africa, with relatively low total numbers of users and penetration. Now, a lot of this unevenness that I'm talking about, it came about because of the actual geographies of internet infrastructure. What you're looking at here is a map of submarine fiber optic cables from a few years ago. You can maybe see that some parts of the world are much better connected than others, and maybe more importantly, some parts just weren't connected at all. Maybe you can see East Africa on this map. It was one of the last parts of our planet that did not have a single fiber optic cable running into it. This is just a close-up of connectivity in the continent from 2009, and this lack of fiber optic connectivity, what it meant was that internet access was much slower and much more expensive than access in much of the rest of the world, because it had to go through satellites. But a lot of these infrastructural constraints are being addressed. This was the landing of the first fiber optic cable into the Kenyan port of Mombasa about 5 years ago. I stood up on the shore there and saw the place where all of these wires that enable all of East Africa's connectivity connect it with the rest of the world. And this is the same map of the region's connectivity now. You can see quite a stark change. So an important question then is to ask whether, because of the increasing amount of internet access that we're seeing around the world, with 3 billion people online now and theoretically low barriers to entry, we need to then ask whether the internet's enabled new and maybe less uneven geographies of knowledge and given space for information that's produced about the global south and for information produced by people in the global south. So let's start by looking at where these new layers of information are. And we can begin by looking at the internet gateway that most of us in this room probably use, and that's Google. So what you're looking at here is a measure of the online content that people are creating about anywhere on Earth and then gets indexed by Google Maps. It's a map of Google Maps, essentially. And you get an indication of some of the massive amount of unevenness in these layers of information that surround us. There's dense clouds of information over some parts of the world, very little over other places. Norway is actually the country with the most content per person when we do this mapping, and then we get the rest of Scandinavia and in fact most of Europe and North America with pretty high counts of content per person. But the scale of these differences is actually perhaps surprising. What might surprise you is that when we did this mapping, there was more content layered over the Tokyo metropolitan region in Japan than the whole of Africa put together. This map is maybe not that useful though, because it just shows you all content in all languages. Nobody really accesses content in all languages. So what I've been doing with my colleague Matthew Zook is working on studying the relative amount of content produced about the same places, but in different languages. So what you're looking at here is a map that compares English and French content that's indexed in Google Maps, and we're zoomed into Eastern Canada here. If there's a red dot, it means there's almost entirely English content about that place. If there's a blue dot, it means there's almost entirely French content about that place. And so if you know anything about Canada, this map wouldn't surprise you at all, right? It's a pattern you'd probably expect to see. There's lots of English content in English-speaking Ontario, lots of French content in French-speaking Quebec. Let me show you another one of these. We see a similar mirroring between offline and online geolinguistic contours in Spain. And without going into too much detail, basically, if there was more Castilian or Spanish content, we made a dot blue here. If there's more Catalan content, we made a dot red. And again, you would see what you might expect to see, more Catalan content in Catalonia and more Spanish content everywhere else. Let me show you one more of these. This time Belgium, and we used appropriate colors this time. If there's more Flemish content, we colored it orange. If there's more French content, we colored it blue. And what we see is that this geolinguistic mapping, it almost perfectly mirrors the divisions between Flemish-speaking Flanders and French-speaking Wallonia. What about a part of the world, though, where there are more unbalanced power dynamics between different linguistic groups? The Middle East, for instance. So this is a map of Arabic and Hebrew content in Israel and the Palestinian territories. A blue dot on this map means that there's more Hebrew content, a red dot means there's more Arabic content. You don't see many red dots, right? So basically what this shows us is that while Arabic and Hebrew content tends to annotate the same physical places, there's really a much denser cloud of Hebrew content over almost all of those places. So the point of this is that there's not only a paucity of online information about a lot of the world, but of that information that exists, a lot of it's just not accessible to a lot of people. And this matters because as these representations start to define a place, and because of these digital augmentations that we all move through, they essentially become part of the virtual scaffolding of a place. So let me show you an example of this. Staying in Israel, what we did was we searched for a restaurant in English in Tel Aviv, something that is a pretty normal online activity. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this map, you can see the search location, the green arrow at the bottom right-hand corner, and you can see the results. So most of the results are clustered on that north-south street or on the street that's going diagonal on the map. Again, this is the results of a search for a restaurant in English in Tel Aviv, a pretty normal thing that you might do. What we then did was we did exactly the same thing from exactly the same location, but this time we used the Hebrew word for restaurant. And you can see some slightly different results. Some of the same places show up, some different places show up, but you're essentially kept in the same part of town, right? You're kept on one of those two streets that we just focused on. But then we did exactly the same thing from exactly the same location in Arabic, and we get restaurants in a fundamentally different place. So the difference in these augmented geolinguistic contours can quite literally mean that we're experiencing and using and enacting fundamentally different cities from one another. What about more explicitly user-generated content online, though? This might give us a better sense of who is and who isn't participating and sharing knowledge and creating content. Let me give you a few examples of this. So what you're looking at here is a map of all content that's submitted to OpenStreetMap, which is the world's largest collaborative mapping project. And if we look at that, we see almost 2/3 of all content created about just 5 countries: the US, France, Canada, Germany, and Russia. And we see something very similar happening if we look at content in Panoramio, which is one of the world's largest photo sharing services. Again, we see a massively concentrated geography of information. I'm not going to go into detail in any of these, but if we look at this one, there's more content created about Italy than all of Africa put together. Now, what I could do is show you maps of a whole range of user-generated content. I'm not going to do that, though. Instead, I'm just going to focus on Wikipedia. And I'm going to do that because Wikipedia is by far the world's biggest and most used encyclopedia. Apparently 15% of all internet users use it on any given day. So statistically speaking, 15% of you in this room have used it today already, or will use it today. It exists in over 280 languages. The English one alone just passed 5 million articles. So I probably don't have to tell you this, but the point is that it's a massively important and influential platform. And on this map, darker shading on the map means that there's more articles about that place. Lighter shading means that there's fewer about that place. You see, again, it's very uneven. Some parts of the world characterized by these dense virtual representations, others barely represented at all. Those are just the raw numbers, though. They're not really normalized for any factors that probably play a key role in determining how much content can be created about any of those places, and that's something I want to talk a bit more about. But let me show you this. This is, again, a cartogram. So each country is a block. The size of each country represents the number of Wikipedia articles in that block. The giant cluster of rectangles on the left-hand side of the screen, that's North America. The big one there is the United States. The even bigger cluster of rectangles in the middle of this graphic, that's Europe. So you see Europe really dominating this representation. Crunched up in the top right-hand corner of the graphic, those are all the Asian countries. Below them, even smaller, that's Australasia, Australia, New Zealand, and some Pacific islands. And then below that, even smaller, is Antarctica. And then at the very bottom left, crunched down in the bottom left-hand corner, you have one of these rectangles for South America and one for Africa. Now, the relative absence of both South America and Africa is really quite notable here. There's more articles in the Netherlands or Poland or Ukraine than the whole continents of South America and Africa. And the first thing that a lot of people tell me when I show this is, well, that's maybe because there's not many internet users in those places, right? So there's not many people creating articles. Well, that's why we put Antarctica on this map, because there's not many internet users in Antarctica either. And so maybe that's quite a shocking thing to me, that there's more articles written about Antarctica than a lot of countries in South America and Africa. Maybe even more surprising than that is that there's more Wikipedia articles written about places that people don't even live in, like fictional places, like Tolkien's Middle-earth, than a lot of countries on our planet. Now, what this map also shows you on a per capita basis is that there's really a lot of content created about Europe in particular, and this is something you can see a bit more vividly in this graph. So the green bars on this graph, those indicate percentage of the world's population, and the blue bars indicate percentage of the world's Wikipedia articles. So look at Asia, which is in the middle of this graphic. Asia has just over 60% of the world's population, but a bit less than 10% of the world's Wikipedia articles written about it. Contrast that to Europe, which is almost the inverse of this, has just over 10% of the world's population, but over half of the world's Wikipedia articles. Now, again, you might think that a lot of this unevenness that I'm talking about can be explained by internet penetration rates, right? Well, again, that's not entirely true. Remember this map of internet penetration that I showed you a few minutes ago. There are obviously large inequalities in internet access around the world, But these uneven geographies of access, they don't really explain all of this unevenness in Wikipedia that we see here. So let me just expand on this very high degree of visibility that's afforded to Europe in particular. And let me do that by showing you a few more maps. What you're looking at here is a map of every single person in Wikipedia. So articles about people. And this map is everyone that was alive in the 15th century. This is the 16th century. This is the 17th century. 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century. So these maps that I was just showing you of people are, we just used the English version of Wikipedia for this. The last maps I show you were all Wikipedias put together in all languages. So but even though these ones are just the English Wikipedia, not the Chinese, not the Hindi, not the Arabic versions, we still saw an incredibly Eurocentric history, right? Now place all of this within the context of one of Wikipedia's mottos, and that's to contain the sum of all human knowledge. And then we start to see that it's perhaps a bit of a dangerous idea to imagine that we're even getting close to having a platform that contains the sum of all human knowledge. What we certainly then need to do is keep a focus on some of these significant biases that are embedded into all of this knowledge that plays a key role in shaping our understandings of the world. And so because of this, I've been working with my colleague Bernie Hogan to ask not just where these Wikipedia articles are, but who's writing them, who can access them, and what this tells us about global patterns of visibility and voice and power. So for instance, what we can do is look at the layers of content in Wikipedia over different countries in different languages to get a sense of who's writing about who. And we see something very interesting happening if we do that. Basically, we see a pattern of countries in the global north that are self-defining and countries in the global south that are largely being defined by others. So what this map shows you is the language of most Wikipedia articles by country. Almost every single European country has more articles about itself in its dominant language than any other language. So in other words, there's more articles in Estonian about Estonia than there are English or Russian or Finnish or German articles about Estonia. There's more articles in German about Germany than French or English articles about Germany. There's one exception to this in Europe, and that's Spain, where there's more Catalan articles about Spain than Spanish or Castilian ones. So in Europe, this pattern largely holds true. What we don't see is that pattern in much of the rest of the world. We see English, which is the blue shade on the map, dominant in much of Africa, in the Middle East, in South and East Asia, and even in parts of South and Central America. And then we see a few other countries where French or German tends to be dominant. So not only do we see most of the world's content written about global cores, but even of the stuff that's written about the rest of the world, a lot of it ends up just being in a few languages. Now, so far, we've been entirely looking at where these layers of content that augment our world are. What about who's creating them? Where do they come from? So what this map shows you is the number of Wikipedia edits that emanate from a country. A darker shade on the map means that there's more edits that come out of that place, and a lighter shade means that there's fewer that comes out of that place. And we basically see, again, that the production of knowledge has very distinct and uneven geographies. And we especially get very, very little coming from anywhere. In Africa, in all of Africa put together, there are fewer edits than come from tiny Hong Kong. Or if we're to look at the Middle East, we can see there's almost as many edits that come from Israel alone as the whole rest of the region put together. Now, because we can figure out where articles are describing, and we can figure out where a lot of those edits come from, we can do what I think is the most interesting thing, which is we can ask who's writing about who. Or in the case of this map, we can ask what percentage of articles about any given place come from local people. So in work that I haven't really put into this presentation, what we did was we statistically modeled the distribution of articles around the world, and the best predictor we could find for the number of articles that come from a place is the number of edits that come from a place. This is maybe the least surprising thing that you've ever heard. If there's a lot of edits from a place, there'll be a lot of articles about that place. But even though edits are a very good predictor of the number of articles that are written about a country, we still see that some places are far more likely to be self-defined by locals, and some places are far more likely to be defined by people from other places. So the yellow shades on this map, they mean that fewer than 5% of edits about articles in those places come from local authors. So if you're a yellow country on this map, almost nothing that's written about you comes from people in that country. Why does this happen? Well, I think this is one reason. What this graph shows you is absolute numbers of local edits in the English Wikipedia by world region. Let me just explain these labels here. On the left, you have Asia, then Europe, then Latin America. MENA is the Middle East and North Africa. Then the giant bar is North America. To its right, Oceania. And then at the very right-hand side, we have Sub-Saharan Africa, SSA. Now, in terms of raw numbers, we see North America and Europe drastically outnumber the remaining world regions in terms of raw numbers of edits. And then conversely, we see Latin America and MENA, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa only commit a very tiny number of within-region edits. So the reason I'm showing you this is because what this means is that even if you take a relatively tiny amount of edits from North America or from Europe, it could easily drown out the edits in some of these places, some of these other places that have a much lower rate of participation, something that we undoubtedly see happening. Let me talk about that a bit more. So what this graph shows you is something else very interesting about the locality of participation and voice in Wikipedia. Let me explain it. So each region of the world is a dot, and we're using the same label. So the one at the top, NOAM, that's North America. Europe is the blue dot, EUR. At the bottom, SSA is Sub-Saharan Africa. MENA is the Middle East and North Africa. So each region of the world is a dot. The vertical axis on this chart, it focuses on the proportion of edits to articles in each region that come from that region. And the horizontal axis focuses on the proportion of a region's committed edits that stay within that region. So in other words, the percentage of edits from a region that are used to write about that region. So on the vertical axis, we see this clear division between regions that are largely able to define themselves, North America, Europe, Oceania, and regions at the bottom that are largely defined by others. So only about a quarter of what's written about these regions at the bottom, about MENA, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, only about a quarter of what's written about them comes from those places. And then the ones on the top, about 3/4 of what's written about those places comes from those places. This we already know, right? This we've talked about a bit. But I think the most interesting thing here is the horizontal axis. So in every part of the world except the Middle East and North Africa, there's more local edits used to write about local things. But that's not the case in the Middle East. So in other words, not only does the Middle East and North Africa have a lot of non-locally generated content written about it, many of the edits coming from that region are actually flowing out. They used to write about other parts of the world. The reason why Sub-Saharan Africa scores so low is not necessarily because editors from that place are not focusing on that place. It's simply that they're getting swamped and overwhelmed by edits that are coming from other places. Now, so far we've just been using a simplified distinction of whether something's local or non-local. What we can actually do is look at the very network of edits, or edit flows. So on this network, the line thickness symbolizes the total number of edits that are received. So for example, if a region receives most of its edits from North America, the edge of the line from North America to that region will be very thick. And that's basically what we see on this graph. North America and Europe are the big exporters of edits. Sub-Saharan Africa, it receives 10.7 times more edits from the outside than it commits to the outside. North America, in contrast, has a figure of 0.38%. You may be getting tired of charts, and so I'm just going to show you one last chart. This one shows you which parts of the world are writing about each other in Wikipedia. So we give each region a color, and the percentage of local edits listed under the region name. So if you look at Europe, which is on the left-hand side, the green dot, 75% of edits are about ourselves in Europe. North America, which is on the top right-hand side, the blue dot, 73% of geographic-related edits are about North America. And again, we can see, if you look at the Middle East, the number's only 36%. And then the colored lines show you where those edits from each region go to or are about. So what those red lines on this network mean is it's showing you where those edits from the Middle East are actually flowing to. So the point is that not only are there not many articles about the Middle East in the first place, there's even fewer in local languages. And not only are there very, very few editors, but even of the edits that exist, a lot of them are used to write about Europe and North America and Asia. So it's almost as if these global informational cores are exerting some sort of informational magnetism, the presence of information creating a virtuous cycle of informational richness, and the absence of information being part of a vicious cycle of informational poverty. Now, what all of these results tell us is that there's not only a lot of content created from the global south, there also isn't a lot of content created about the south. A lot of people and places are both literally and figuratively left off the map. There are distinct data shadows and distinct digital divisions of labor. Now, we've always had informational inequalities, but the digital layers of places, they mean that the internet and the ability to produce digital encoded information might start to amplify some of these older imbalances of voice and power and participation. We're not just deepening the divides between different parts of our world, we're also seeding local voice and creating layers of places that aren't necessarily representative of the underlying people and processes and contexts that exist there. So the question then is why? When the world's getting wired, when internet penetration rates are rising rapidly, why are there still these massive absences? Well, I could talk about this all in much more detail, but basically we do know that there isn't a simple answer to the very uneven geographies of information and voice that we see. It's also clear that the narrative of connectivity isn't really what we're looking for. The idea that connecting the previously disconnected will solve a sort of digital divide and bring people into a global knowledge economy then seems a bit misguided. We already see that connectivities are necessary, but by no means a sufficient condition. But some of the qualitative research that we've been doing on the same topic, and others have been doing on the same topic, it also shows us that we need to pay attention to things like the impacts of post-colonial modes of informational governance, the culturally contingent ways that participation and representation take place, the affordances of platforms and infrastructures of connectivity, the constraints of explicit and implicit censorship, the gendered or class constraints to access or production, and the availability or absence of a broader information ecosystem of geographic content. Now, one point I've already made is that as information becomes ever more infused into our urban environments, the question of what and where is represented and who's creating those representations becomes ever more important. But at this very moment in which relatively immutable geographic information is augmenting our urban environments, it's not just our cities being transformed, it's also information itself. So in order for entities like Google and Wikipedia and OpenStreetMap and many other types of geographic information to be able to augment cities, what needs to happen is that geographic content needs to be able to be detached from its containers. And this is something that seems like a paradox. So for information to become fixed onto places, it needs to become unfixed from its containers. And this is done through things like linked data, appropriate file formats and databases, and a broader move towards what people are calling the semantic web. Information about places is then no longer just mutable and ephemeral. It's no longer just immutable and contained within its containers. It's increasingly both immutable and augmented, immutable and unfixed. And the result of this untethering of content from its containers is a world in which it's increasingly difficult to ask and answer these sorts of questions about information geographies that we're trying to get at here. But there's also another way that I want to sum all of this up. So if we do see our cities or the places that we live in as augmented hybrid forms in which the materials blending with the digital, something that most of us probably do, then I think there are important questions that we need to be asking about not just participation and not just representation, which is what I've been doing here, but also about rights, and specifically about what sort of rights to the city we have and should have. So what I want to argue here is that we might be able to learn from the rich debate about the right to the city that has been happening for a long time. So the scholar David Harvey, for instance, he tells us, this is a quote from him, "The right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It's a right to change ourselves by changing the city." So maybe what we need to do a better job of formulating is an informational right to the city, an informational right to the augmented city. And this is something that one of my colleagues, Joe Shaw, and I are doing at the moment, trying to think through this question. But maybe this is straying a bit far from the presentation that I gave you today. Maybe the most appropriate place to end all of this is to turn back to the uneven geographies of information that I've been speaking about today. And maybe the way to end is with a more practical plea to think about those uneven geographies the next time we do something like use Google to find a restaurant or look something up on Wikipedia. Let's remember that our digital tools are usually just amplifying the already most visible, the most powerful, and the most prominent things. And let's maybe look for alternatives, different stories, different narratives, different mediators. Our world's always going to be augmented by this sort of digital information, but let's always try to remember what it leaves out. Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm happy to continue the discussion.